Welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Micah Streifer, and I'm the director of Laasok. Laasok is a virtual liberal Beit Midrash. It's a community of learners who come together to connect with our Judaism and connect with each other by studying sacred texts, and by doing so in an inclusive, progressive environment. What we believe and what we are as a community is summed up by the tagline, Sacred Texts, Modern Meaning. This social justice in our text series is an expression of that larger mission of sacred texts, modern meaning. Starting today, we're going to meet about once a month from now until June to explore various aspects of social justice in Jewish texts and what Judaism has to say to us about creating a just society. That begins with our session today on K'vod Hab'riyot, the value of human dignity, with Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. I'll just mention briefly that in addition to this kind of drop-in learning, Laasok also organizes various kinds of weekly study sessions on Torah, on Talmud, on Midrash, as well as learning series and various kinds of drop-in learning. If you're interested in expanding your Jewish learning, just drop me a note in the chat or send me an email. I'm going to stick my email into the chat, and you can feel free to be in touch with me. And I would love to talk with you about ways to expand your learning or to dig more deeply into Jewish learning. I am very grateful. We are very grateful to all of our partner organizations who've come together to make this series happen. So let me just name them: the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the CCAR Press, Tzedek Box, Dayenu, the Union for Reform Judaism, Kirva, Keeping It Sacred, Central Synagogue, Temple Israel of Greater Miami, and Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina. It is a mighty coalition, and we're really proud and we're really grateful that for this group of incredible partners. I also want to convey deep thanks to two individuals, members of the Laasok community, who helped make this program possible, and that's Robert Goldman and Lauren Davis, both of whom are here with us today, as well as to all of you who made contributions to help support this program. Thanks for being here, and thanks for making this possible. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our teacher for today, Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. But before I do that, I want to turn things over for a minute to one of our partners, Rabbi Andrew Kaplan-Mandel of Tzedek Box, to help us set an intention for this study and for this series. Rabbi Andrew, if you'll unmute.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. We are hoping to link study, action, and reflection in this space on an ongoing basis. So as you put aside whatever you were doing before you joined this Zoom, I want to tell you about the Tzedek Box, a new ritual dedicated to the Jewish call for justice. A Tzedek Box is like a Tzedek Box, but instead of coins, you put in a journal entry where you've written about the work you've been doing out in the world, what you've learned from that work, and what you hope to remember. This helps us process our experiences, think about how we want to act next, and hold us accountable for taking action in the first place. At the end of the year in May, you'll be invited to open your box if you choose to make one and take stock of whatever you've done over time. So we're going to try this right now. We're going to take 60 seconds. I'm going to offer a bit of music, and you're going to, if you're interested and willing, to write down on a slip of paper one thing that you have been doing when it comes to adding righteousness to the world. Maybe you have been trying to get out the vote. Maybe you have contacted your representatives about an issue that matters to you. Maybe you've been volunteering. Maybe you just made a donation. Just choose one thing for now. What have you been up to? Why did it matter to you? And what does it make you want to do next? I'm going to invite everyone to take a quiet moment to do that while I offer a little music. Yai dai dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai dai, yai dai dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai, Yadai dai. Pitchu li sharet tzedek. Avovam Odeya Pitchu Sharet Tzedek Avovam Odeya Pitchu Sharet Tzedek Avovam Odeya Pitchu Sharet Tzedek Avovam Odeya. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lirdof tzedek. May the study we do today inspire future cycles of action and reflection. Thank you.
Amen. And if you'd like, feel free to share in the chat what it is that you were thinking about, if there's a word or a phrase about the tzedek that you've helped bring into the world. I'm excited now to introduce our speaker, our teacher for this afternoon, Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. Rabbi Lauren Tuchman is a sought-after speaker, spiritual leader, and educator who was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2018. She teaches on a variety of matters pertinent to disability access and inclusion. She was named to the New York Jewish Week's 36 to Watch for her innovative leadership concerning inclusion of Jews with disabilities in all aspects of Jewish life. In 2017, she delivered an Eli talk entitled, "We All Were at Sinai, the Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah." In addition to her work in the disability inclusion space, Rabbi Tuchman passionately believes in the power of spiritual and contemplative practice as a path to transformational change. And that powers her involvement at Kirva, as well as the Institute for Jewish Spirituality's clergy leadership program. I'll invite you to check out more about her website so you can learn more about her, because I would rather spend the time learning with Rabbi Tuchman. I'll just mention that Rabbi Tuchman is also a contributor to the Social Justice Torah Commentary, published by CCAR Press, which is one of our partners in this program. She wrote one chapter in that book, and the CCAR Press has generously provided a discount code for participants in this program. If you would like to buy that book, the Social Justice Torah Commentary, you can just go to the link that I just put into the chat and use discount code SJ20, which I'll put into the chat as well. And our great thanks to the CCAR Press for making that available at a discount to us. Two quick technical notes. We will ask you to stay muted during the session, but we do intend this to be interactive. So if you have comments or thoughts you'd like to share, please raise your hand electronically or put your ideas into the chat. I'm going to ensure that Rabbi Tuchman is aware of comments and hands during the session. And finally, I'd like to invite you to join me in the blessing for study. I'm going to share my screen. We'll join together in this blessing, and then I'll turn things right over to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. Please join me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the eternal source of the universe, whose commandments make our lives holy, and who has commanded us to immerse, to engage in words of Torah. And now I'll turn things over to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi Streifer. Thank you so much to Rabbi Kaplan Mandel. There's no better way to start learning than with music. So what a bracha that was. I am so delighted to be with all of you today to really dive into a really important foundational Jewish value of K'vod Hab'riyot, which I'm going to translate for us as human dignity, but we could also translate that as honoring creatures, honoring creation. I want to say a few words in framing before we get into the text that we'll be looking at today. And the first thing I want to start with is to say that K'vod Hab'riyot is both foundational and aspirational. What do I mean by that? That we, as we know, as all of us in this Zoom room know, and all of us who will be watching later know, we live in a world in which human dignity is daily trampled upon. And I wish that wasn't so, and I imagine all of us wish that wasn't the case. But it's at times like these when it feels particularly acute, the lack of human dignity that too many of us experience, that is really when we have to dig very deep into our values. Because it's really easy when the world feels like it's going well for us. It's really easy to say, oh, I have these beautiful values and I really try to live aligned with them. But when things feel much harder and much more weighty, that is really the time when the rubber meets the road. And this is when we really have to dig into the beautiful well of our tradition and find the values that will move us forward in ways that are nourishing and nurturing and honoring of every human life and every human soul. So that is, I think, something that is really important to name. That whenever, in my opinion, when we're learning Torah, ultimately we're trying to protect that little spark within us that is yearning for a better world, and we do that through connection with this ancestral wisdom that we have across time and space and distance, and also to add our own perspectives to it, to challenge it, to be in relationship with it, not simply to absorb it but actually to engage with it. And that's my invitation for all of us today. I am going to be presenting, we have 3 texts today, but we'll probably not get to the third and final. We may, but we'll probably mostly spend time on the first text. And I want to say before we get into that text, it's a text that I was taught initially by my dear mentor, teacher, colleague, and friend, Rabbi Dr. Bert Visotsky, who was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I was ordained a rabbi. It has been a transformative text for me since I learned it from him, and I have found so much in there to really work with. And there are a lot of different ways to learn this text. So I'm going to be teaching it from a very particular perspective today about talking about human dignity. There are also far more contemplative ways to look at this text. I have many teachers who've taught it from that perspective of the difference between being rigid versus being more open. There are lots of really beautiful ways, and there's no one way to understand it, which is why I think it's so beautiful and why I think learning Torah is so meaningful, because most of the time there is no one way to learn anything. So I think our text today in particular is going to invite us into what I hope is a very rich and honest discussion about how we show up in the world, how we treat other people, how we treat people who are different from us. So what I'm going to invite now is I'm going to invite us to screen share, and I'm going to turn it back to Rabbi Streifer, who will go ahead and read the text for us in its entirety. But I want to say before that we'll read just the English. And because this is taken from the Steinsaltz edition of the Talmud, which is an incredible achievement, because it's taken from there, the English translation is also an interpolation. There are words in there that are Rabbi Steinsaltz, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing, are his particular understandings. So just to note that, but we're going to read it as it's presented, but just to name that some of the words are direct translation and some of them are explanation. So I'll turn it to you, Rabbi Streifer.
All right, great. So this is from Talmud Bavli, Tractate Ta'anit, page 20a and b. The sages further taught in praise of the reed. A person should always be soft like a reed, and he should not be stiff like a cedar. An incident occurred in which Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, came from Migdal Gedor, from his rabbi's house, and he was riding on a donkey and strolling on the bank of the river. And he was very happy, and his head was swollen with pride because he had studied much Torah. He happened upon an exceedingly ugly person who said to him, "Greetings to you, my rabbi." But Rabbi Elazar did not return his greeting. Instead, Rabbi Elazar said to him, "Worthless, Reka person, how ugly is that man? Are all the people of your city as ugly as you?" The man said to him, "I do not know, but you should go and say to the craftsman who made me, How ugly is the vessel you made. When Rabbi Elazar realized that he had sinned and insulted this man merely on account of his appearance, he descended from his donkey and prostrated himself before him. And he said to the man, I have sinned against you, forgive me. The man said to him, I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made. He walked behind the man, trying to appease him, until they reached Rabbi Elazar's city. The people of his city came out to greet him, saying to him, greetings to you, my rabbi, my master, my master. The man said to them, who are you calling my rabbi, my rabbi? They said to him, to this man who is walking behind you. He said to them, if this man is a rabbi, may there not be many like him among the Jewish people. They asked him, for what reason do you say this? He said to them, he did such and such to me. They said to him, even so, forgive him, as he is a great scholar. He said to them, for your sakes I forgive him, provided that he accepts upon himself not to become accustomed to behave like this. Immediately Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, entered the study hall and taught, a person should always be soft like a reed, and he should not be stiff like a cedar, as one who is proud like a cedar is likely to sin. And therefore, due to its gentle qualities, the reed merited that a quill is taken from it to write with it a Torah scroll, phylacteries or tefillin, and mezuzot.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for reading that, Rabbi Streifer. I want to start out by offering a couple of textual context notes. And then before offering my framing and my take on this, which is ever evolving, I really want to hear from you. So if you have a comment or a question, I invite you to either put it into the chat and then Rabbi Streifer can read those aloud, or raise your electronic Zoom hand. And the way that we'll do that is I'll take a few questions or a few comments together after I offer a couple of initial thoughts. I want to hear as many voices as we can. So one way that I find that works really well is if I take a few comments at a time and then respond in one comment rather than responding to each individual comment. So quick contextual or textual things that I think are important. One of the things that I think is important to know, this is a piece of what is known as Haggadah, which is from the same root that we know of Haggadah, which is the telling, the text we use on Pesach, on Passover. This is a rabbinic story, and usually, but not always, but often Aggadot or rabbinic stories in the Talmud have some kind of moral lesson, which I think this does in many different ways. This text is in the 3rd chapter of a section of Talmud called Seder Moed, which is a large section of subsections that have to do with the holidays. And ta'anit means fasts. So that refers to fasts that would be called when rain did not come at its proper time. And there was an idea that I think we probably all in this space would find really hard to accept, but there was a theological idea that the rabbis had that human action directly contributed to whether or not rain would fall. So there's a chapter in Ta'anit, it's actually a really powerful chapter of the rabbis basically sharing all of these different anecdotes and stories about different rabbinic behavior and different moral lessons to take from that. Something that some folks may know in this space is that Honi HaMa'agal, Honi the circle maker, his series of stories is in the same section. And the other thing to just name is that Tsar ben Shimon is the son of Rashbi, of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who was a Tana who lived at the time of the Mishnah, and the Zohar credits him as the one who created the Zohar. Scholars basically have consensus that the Zohar was in fact created in, I believe, 13th and 14th century, in 12th and 13th century Spain. But there's a notion that the Zohar, which is this massive compilation of Kabbalistic work, was attributed to Shimon bar Yochai. But the reason that it's important to mention him is because Shimon bar Yochai is also famous for spending 12 years in a cave learning Torah with his son Eliezer. And then he emerges from the cave and he's very angry at somebody who is engaging in harvesting a carob tree, if I'm not mistaken. And he says, why isn't everyone learning Torah the way they should be? And Hashem, in this story, which I think is in Masechet Shabbat, in Tractate Shabbat of the Talmud, basically in this particular text, the divine says to Shimon Bar Yochai, well, if that's how you feel, you need to go back in the cave if you're going to treat my people that way, so he goes back in the cave for another 12 years. So he's got very particular views on how people should be. And the only person he was with, it seems like, was his son Elazar. So just kind of naming that Elazar comes from a particular lineage and a particular perspective. I'm going to pause there, and I really want to offer folks to think about the following question as you are thinking about your comments. What's coming up for you as you read this text? Are there different pieces of this that are particularly challenging or interesting or really call to you in a particular way? We're going to get into more specific pieces of it, but I really just want to hear first a round of general reactions, and then we'll kind of unpack a little bit of it together.
As people are thinking about that and putting it into the chat, Rabbi Tuchman, we have 2 comments in the chat and 1 hand up. Can I go ahead and read what's in the chat now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So Helene says, so appropriate for Elul. This rabbi has sinned against a walker outside the city as well as against God. And then Alfred added a quote from Isaac Bashevis Singer, quote, 2 important things are to have an interest in people and to be kind to them. Kindness, I've discovered, is everything in life.
I love that. Thank you.
There's 2 other comments in the chat, and then I'm going to call, if it's okay with you, on Joy and Peter Vanek. Here in the chat, Jerry Friedman says, as a severely disabled person, I can easily relate to having my dignity trashed somewhat often. That text feels like a common experience for me. And then Rabbi Paula Goldberg says you have to ask forgiveness from the one you insulted, and the word one is capitalized here. And so that as the text also, I mean, clearly there are no capital letters in Hebrew, but the English translation makes clear that the one who's been insulted here is the divine.
Thank you. Yeah, let's call on the folks who have their hands raised.
Peter and Joy, go ahead.
A pleasure to learn with you, Rabbi. I also have experienced unkindness. I have mobility issues. My walking is difficult, and I'm often on a mobility scooter. And I'm not trying to change the story, so please understand. But it's interesting that the story is about 2 rabbis. I would have been much happier if the story was about just people who are not rabbis. We hold our rabbis to a higher standard, but we should hold all people to the same high standard when they are dealing with one another.
Absolutely. I want to respond to that directly. Thank you for sharing your experience. And I do want to make one tiny note. The man who is insulted is not a rabbi. In this particular story, the man who does the insulting is a rabbi, but the man who greets him is presumably not, although we don't know that definitively, but he's presumably not. But your point, though, that it doesn't matter, everyone should be held to a high standard, is really well taken. Because for sure, the way that especially, and I can speak for myself as a person with a disability as well, the way that dignity gets really just very deeply trampled on and disregarded, and it's really difficult, right? And like being with that and just acknowledging and recognizing that is part of our lived experience. I dearly wish it wasn't, but it is. Being able to really acknowledge that and find a little bit of reflection of that, I think is really important. And that, yeah, for sure, we should be absolutely holding people to a very high standard of behavior. And I think particularly when we are in a world that we seem to be losing that, how do we use our study to kind of remind us of that value? So thank you for that. That's a beautiful share. Do we have any other hands?
We do. And actually, we have another comment in the chat from Amy, who said, making it known we are all God's children. no matter any demographic difference of ours, and God decided to give us any differences we have.
Thank you.
And we have
Yeah.
sorry.
No, go on.
We have one more hand up from D. Go ahead, D.
Hi, thank you, Rabbi. The just in response to that other comment, it seems to me that people wanted to excuse the rabbi in this story, and that's the part that's so resonant to me from two sides. I can imagine, for a start, I think as a community we do tend to excuse those we think are we start with the idea that they're holy, so we don't want to say, oh, maybe this person has done something wrong. And secondly, I can also see an instance where, being a leader in my community, like if somebody catches you on a bad day, their experience of you can be so dramatically different to a lot of people, right? So we've got this thing here where these people have really gotten a lot of wisdom out of this rabbi, and then this other person who's just got this terrible, terrible experience of him. And both of those things can be true.
Yes, and I really want to sit with that, Dee. Thank you very much for your comment. Yeah, I think that we do tend to, I think human beings often find ways to excuse really bad behavior in people that we consider leaders. We often have a hard time we often as human beings, I think, have a very difficult time accepting, particularly if, as you said, our experience of someone is really lovely, right? If we have a really lovely experience with somebody and we've had a really lovely relationship, it's really difficult to then hear like, oh, actually this other person had this drastically different experience. And sometimes when we aren't able to sit with that, and we aren't able to accept that that's true, it can leave the other person feeling even more outside of the community because they aren't believed, or maybe they did something like, is it my fault that I had this bad experience, rather than it could just be exactly as you said, catching someone on a bad day. And I think that this is a rabbi all the time, right? Like I will often I'll often get emails from people that are very distressed about something that's arisen in their Jewish experience, whether I have anything to do with it or not. Usually they find me online or whatever. And if it's a disability related issue, often I get a lot of comments about different things that have happened. And I have to be really careful in my own responses. Often I'll take a little bit of time to respond so that I am in a place of being able to approach that inquiry from this person who is in deep distress without taking it on to the point where I kind of blend in, but also saying like, how can I be in support of you and also really, allow you to figure out what the right path is? Because I think often people feel increasingly separated and isolated. And so, we have all these different pieces around. We don't want to excuse this poor behavior as is happening in the text, and also trying to be with the multitude of experience, and also trying to recognize that the multitude of experience exists, right? Like it's often particularly for those of us, if you've had a really good experience with someone, it can be really hard to recognize that that is not universally true. I think that that's where we tend to get into a lot of deep complication as a human species.
I think those are all the comments in the chat and in the and hands up at this moment.
So I want to move us forward to thinking about a couple of different parts of this text. One of my favorite lines, so actually I want to back up to the beginning, where we're told that Rabbi Elazar is riding on his donkey on the bank of the river. So I'm kind of imagining it's a really peaceful afternoon and he's riding home and he's feeling great, right? Because he's learned all of this Torah with his rabbi that day. And when it says that he's coming from the high tower, which is what it says in the text, That's a coded reference. And I want to thank my teacher, Rav Tali Adler, for this. That's a coded reference to he is coming home from the high tower. So the rabbis are coding, I think, in a really brilliant and kind of playful way. Like, yeah, this guy's kind of full of it, and he's coming home from that place of being full of it. Or maybe we could even say, he's coming out of that place of being full of it, and he's going to encounter a scenario that's going to really cause him to have to tremendously re-examine a lot of what he assumes. So he's walking along, or he's riding along rather, and he encounters this gentleman. We don't know anything about him. The text tells us nothing, which I think on the one hand is honest in that many of us who in any way, shape, or form are marginal in our given society, and I'm specifically thinking of people with disabilities, but I want to name also that this particular gentleman, we have no idea how what he would have called himself. Also, the way that disability existed in the ancient world was extraordinarily different than how it is now. But that being said, for our purposes, I am going to use the term disability in referring to him. But whatever it is about this particular person, there is something that in some way is deeply resistant to Rav Elazar. And I would say repellent, but that is a really strong word. So I'm going to go ahead and say there's something that this gentleman has that in some way is really unsettling to Elazar. And the text uses the term reka, which actually means empty or worthless, which is a terrible, terrible term to use, but it's emblematic of how Elazar is thinking about this man. And what I love so much, what I think this text is doing really brilliantly, is the man says, wow, if you're going to behave to me, if you're going to behave like that towards me with such disregard, and ask, this is obviously my interpretation, and ask are all the people from my town as ugly as I am? Well, go and ask the craftsman who created me, how ugly is the vessel you made, which is a tremendous theological claim, right? Because this man is saying, wow, if I'm imagining him being taken aback. Like, if that's your response, you don't ask my name, you don't ask anything about me. You jump automatically to, wow, you're ugly. If that's your automatic response, well, have you learned any Torah today, sir? I imagine this guy saying, like, have you learned anything in Torah? Right? Like, go and talk to God. Go and talk to God and say to God, wow, how ugly is the vessel you made? And it makes me think of as we're nearing the end of our Torah cycle, we're going to soon, in about a little over a month, we're going to read Bereshit, the first parsha in the Torah, and in there we have the very famous verse that we're all created in the image of the divine, which means that there are lots of different ways to understand that. But one of the ways that the Jewish tradition has understood it over time is that every human being has inherent dignity and worth. Every single one. And so if that's in fact the case, then this guy is saying, you better go talk to God and ask God, how ugly is the vessel you made? Which is so brilliant. And then the question arises, and this is where I would love to hear what other people think before I share my perspective. The question arises, does Rabbi Elazar get that he has grievously erred here? Right? There is I believe there is an intentional ambiguity in the text. I have my own particular read of it, but if you think about the next part where he gets down and he's prostrating and he's begging for forgiveness, and the man is not forgiving him, and he says, I'll forgive you, but you better go talk to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? Do you think in that moment that Rabbi Elazar recognizes the depth of what he's done? Or not? I'm curious what people think about that. Or if that's not of interest, another question would be, how do you perceive the man's response to what appears to be Rabbi Eliezer's contrition?
We have Amy's hand up, followed by Rabbi Paula.
Mm-hmm. My impression is that he's either going to be slow grasping everything, He feels like he has to do something, like he's been backed into a corner. He's putting on a show. Perhaps he was socialized to do it or something. But I'm not completely certain if he grasps it. I mean, we can pare it back, say thank you or sorry as necessary due to social skills we are trained to have as soon as we can speak. Dig deeper. You have to genuinely mean something if its energy is going to transition to its recipient. And it doesn't strike me as very clear. He
Yeah,
needs to fix something.
Thank you so much for that. Rabbi Paula?
Okay, so I'm going to give Rabbi Elazar a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here and say, in the moment that the man says, go ask the craftsman, I think Rabbi Elazar understands that he has just insulted God. If people are made in the image of God, then that man that he deems, or our narrator deems to be so ugly, he's saying, God, you're ugly. And my sense is that he falls from his pride. That idea of prostrating yourself is to, falling flat on your face. But he's someone who has raised his humanity, his own humanity, above some other person's humanity. And it doesn't matter that he's a rabbi and the other person is not a rabbi. It doesn't matter what he looks like or what the other person looks like. He has made a decision about the creation of human beings and about human beings. He's put himself above. And I think in that moment that this person says, ask the craftsman, number one, I think that there is a realization that maybe I'm not as smart as I think I am. This guy is pretty smart, because he answered in a way that is a rabbinic way of answering, I think. So to me, whether it holds or not for the rest of the time, I think that I'll give Elazar the benefit of the doubt to say that when he falls to the ground, he realizes that he has come low and that he is not as elevated as he thinks he is or was.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, do we have any other comments before I respond?
We do. I have a few in the chat and then a couple more hands up.
Oh, great.
The chat is much more skeptical than Rabbi Paula is. Someone said, I'm just going to try to give the gist because there are a lot of them, but someone says, no, he doesn't recognize what he's done because he doesn't immediately ask God's forgiveness. No, not in the moment of prostration. Someone said, I'm not sure he's not just worried about appearances. He's looking for an easy way out. Jerry says, I'm not so sure he does. The man's refusal to accept his apology, I wouldn't accept it either. It feels phony. And then D says, I love how this man immediately splits the insult from himself. Rabbi Elazar calls him worthless. He turns it and talks about the vessel, his body as a vessel for his true being.
Oh, I love that. I want to respond to that last one before we hear hear those who've raised their hands. That's so beautiful. I hadn't thought about it in that way, that he really is this man is saying, my body is a vessel. It's a part of creation. You've just called me Reka. You've just called me completely worthless. Like, that's terrible. And that's a reflection on perhaps, maybe this is, again, this is me droshing on it. Maybe that's a reflection on him, on Elazar, and, his own stuff. Because I often, I'll say on a personal level, which is one of the reasons I love this text so much, is that I think that oftentimes when we encounter that kind of insult, and a lot of times when I teach this text, people say, does that really happen? Unfortunately, it does, right? I wish this was the kind of thing that we could say, wow, that's a crazy story in the Talmud. That doesn't really happen in the world. wish that's the case. But one of the beautiful things I think Torah gives us is that it gives us an ability to really inquire into ourselves. And that's what we're doing in Elul as well, traditionally, is really inquiring and asking ourselves the question of, where am I? How can I get so low? And asking ourselves, like, have we done that? But I think also to what Rabbi Paul said, I think that you raised a lot of really important points as well. You know, that moment, I know for myself, like I've had moments like that recently. I had a moment where I sort of stepped into something I didn't intend to at Shabbat dinner last week. It's not a huge deal. It was definitely a moment where I was like, oh, I'm feeling the constriction. I'm like, oh no, I like stepped into it. I mean, not to this extent, not by a long shot, but you know, that moment of like, didn't need to do that in that particular way. And so thinking through, like, what do I do though in that moment? How do I do tshuva, or how do I, you know, do what I need to do to change things? And luckily, the thing I'm thinking of was very, very minor. But you know, still, I think we've all had those incidents in our lives where that's happened, and we recognize, oh, I thought I was doing one thing, and actually I was doing another. So all of that, I think, basically, that's all to say that everything we've heard thus far, I think, is all extraordinarily important and really asks us to do some deep digging. So I'm going to turn it to Rabbi Streifer now for more hands.
Sure. We have Dr. David Aronson, and then followed by Peter and Joy Vanek.
Actually, my wife, Cheryl.
Yeah, a couple of different things. One is that Rabbi Elazar says, I have sinned against you, forgive me. And he's talking to this man. And in actuality, you know, the man is saying, I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me. And what he's not saying is, it's not me you sinned against. It's the craftsman. You only insulted me, but it's the craftsman you actually sinned against. And he's not saying that clearly. So if Rabbi Elazar hasn't gotten that figured out for himself, this other man isn't making it clear to him that that's what has really happened. And another thought that I had is that he's calling him ugly. He's breaking this person down to his outer shell. He's nothing but an outer shell to Rabbi Elazar. You know, you're ugly. That's all you are. Is you're worthless because you're ugly. You know, it's not crossing his mind that this man is ugly, but there may be something worthwhile inside. And just because this one is ugly, they must all be ugly from his city. And this Rabbi Elazar, he's got brains. We know he's got brains because the Talmud tells us that. But in this story here, that's all gone. It totally erases that and shows us that even a person with brains can
Sometimes not use them.
sometimes really screw up.
Yeah, thank you. I want to respond really quickly to that, then we'll take the next comment that I'll move us to another part of the text. Yeah, I think what you're naming there is really important to just underscore that so often we think about we dehumanize. That's the word I'm looking for. We dehumanize. This is what's happening here, right? And one interpretation that I think is very clear from what you're saying is Rabbi Elazar utterly dehumanizes this man. He's nothing more than the perception that Rabbi Elazar has. There's nothing more than that. And it is so easy, and I fear it's getting easier, to dehumanize other people. And once you dehumanize somebody, then you can basically all bets are off, right? Because they're outside of that circle of care or that circle of concern. So I think that we need to just really notice the dehumanization that's happening in this text that I think that you're articulating really beautifully here. Than him saying, well, if that's how this guy, if that's how you look, well, everyone from your city must be just like you. How often does that happen? How often have any of us experienced that? Oh, everyone who is like you is like this, right? That's where oppressions come from, right? And I think that unfortunately, that's something that many of us have had experience with on a personal level. So it's something that I think we need to be really careful of in our minds, of how our minds will tell us things like, oh, that man is ugly, that means he's worthless. And then we assume that that's true without question. And it's not. We have to be really attentive to that. So I'll take the next comment and then we'll move on to another part of the text.
Okay, Joy and Peter, go ahead.
I want to make two quick comments. First of all, I agree with and like what Rabbi Paula said. I think the man, the ugly man, had a lot of chutzpah not accepting the apology of Rabbi Elazar. On the surface anyway, it appears that Rabbi Elazar realized that he had sinned, and I'm reading. He got off his donkey and prostrated himself. All the appearances of a true apology. The man said, no, it's not good enough. And the second point I wanted to make is that we tend to put people in boxes, and even more so today than in the past. And as an example, there was a post on Facebook not a couple of days ago where a woman went to a medical clinic and the technician was wearing a hijab. Jewish woman went to and she said, I don't want this person doing the test on me. Well, that's putting people in boxes, and I think that's what this did as well. When he says, are all the people in your city as ugly as you are? Without thinking, you put this whole group, this whole city in a box of ugly people, or Palestinians, or Arabs, or disabled people, or I can go on and on and on and on.
Yeah, I think you're raising some really important points. Thank you very much for that. And it's really a shame, right, that we do this to people, that we put them in these boxes, we make assumptions, often split second decisions and judgments that are really hurtful. Like especially the examples that you gave. I found my heart really aching for the person who had that experience of not wanting of having someone say, because you have a hijab, I don't want you to do a test on me. That's a really hard experience, and what are the ways in which we as people get into our place of fear and constriction, and either we don't act aligned with our best selves. I've certainly had plenty of experiences like that myself, or we just make these snap judgments. I think that that's something really important. And actually, that's a great segue for where I wanted to take us. And I know we're running close on time here, but I wanted to take us in closing to one other part of the text, and then I want to invite us to have any last comments. So there are two pieces that I really want to briefly talk about. One of them is that the apology or the non-apology apology, however we want to call it, kind of continues, where when both people get to the town and the townspeople come and they say, well, greetings to you, my rabbi, and the other gentleman says, who are you calling my rabbi? And they say, Rabbi Elazar. And the gentleman says, well, if you're going to call him rabbi, may there not be many like him among the Jewish people. So if we're thinking about this from the perspective of someone who is just like, this guy has not done tshuva, this is a major insult, there better not be rabbis like this. there are so many ways that we can take this, right? And one way we might be able to take this is, again, to kind of go back to something we started out here of like higher standard, or maybe not even higher standard, but all of us need to be so aware of our how we treat other people. And so often we don't have I honestly believe part of why human dignity is so trampled often is that we don't have the skill set to grapple with our initial reaction, right? Because so often we kind of get taken over by that initial primal reaction, that sense of like, oh my gosh, there's somebody who's different from me, and this is going to what am I going to do? We don't actually pause and ask ourselves like, oh, that's my initial reaction, but can I kind of get underneath that a little bit, right? Can I, instead of being so quick, can I be like, well, that's different. Maybe I need to now take a second to like realize like this is a person just like I am. I don't need to act on the first thought that pops into my head. Maybe I can notice it and actually spend a minute and be like, is that really the person I want to be in this world? So that's one thing I think we can take from this. But I think in terms of leaders, that's even more true. And by the frame. So we didn't really talk about how this text is framed. And it's framed about that one should be soft like a reed and they should not be stiff like a cedar. And that a reed merited that we create quills from it that are used to write Torah scrolls and tefillin and mezuzot, right? So the softness, the lacking in rigidity, right? The ability to be with what is and to be able to be responsive and not reactive. That is the idea that we get from the reed. And that's how we get that quill. That's the sense that I think that this text is trying to give us of like responsiveness and non-reactivity often creates for more or allows for more ability and spaciousness around human dignity. I mean, I can tell you, and this is not an abstraction for me as a disabled person. I mean, every day, I can have the most beautiful encounter with a friend or someone comment that like really, happened today, and make a comment that like really rubs me the wrong way. And I have to in that moment be like, okay, how am I going to navigate this? This is hurt. Like this hurt. This person did not mean it that way. It's very clear to me that they did not mean it that way. And there's some projection happening or whatever the case may be. But what I have found for myself is, you can't control the external, and I can actually create more internal spaciousness. That does not mean necessarily that I think that the man who was insulted was necessarily in the wrong, right? To navigate that. I don't know his backstory. I often wonder what his experiences were like. I know for myself that often when I've been in those situations, the thing that I want to do most acutely is crawl into a hole somewhere and never emerge again, right? And I often find in those moments that I don't have the ability to respond. It was said earlier, that the man did not accept Rabbi Elazar's apology. And I think that that's a really valid interpretation, that one could read this as this man is really rigid and very difficult. And, I think a lot of us have had that experience as well of either being that rigidly difficult person or working with rigidly difficult people. And when I find myself in that place, which I often do because of the work that I do, I often find that I am working with people that are rigid, and I myself have been that way. I often find when that frustration arises for me, I have to be like, how did this happen? And I ask that of this text. How is it the case that this particular man had the constellation of reaction and response that he did, right? And we'll never know, but I can, like, part of why learning Torah is such a beautiful thing to do is because I think a lot of times you can kind of find yourself there and ask, like, oh, have I been in that, not necessarily situation that we're working with today of walking, riding on a riverbank and then having someone insult you? Have I been in a situation where someone's been really unkind, and has that just been the final straw? What is this man's life like? Not that that's an excuse at all, but like, what is this man's life like? And to flip it around and think about the other interpretation of Rabbi Elazar is not contrite, how did he get to be where he is? I mean, so often, we human beings are interacting with each other and we're all kind of like this mishmash of everything that's ever come before, right? And then we kind of meet new people and we're like, oh, you just really pushed my buttons, right? Like I'm imagining this guy just feeling like every button's been pushed. And I had an experience of that myself recently. And so when you're in that space of just feeling like everything has been pushed, it can be really hard to figure out how to separate, like how to like the most skillful response in that moment. But it's also a very good lesson to us about how in our own little spheres of influence, right? How are we showing up for others? And I want to just really clarify and make sure that it's understood as we're closing, that unfortunately, people with disabilities are really often deeply, deeply, deeply mistreated is a gentle word, right? Many people with disabilities live in a world or have many, many, many life experiences of just complete lack of regard. And so when I tap into that part of my experience where I can really get that this man is just had it gives me that sense of compassion of like, I am just so tired of my dignity being trampled. Please remember that when you insult me, you insult the divine. I'm part of this world too. And that's, I think, also there's so many different takeaways from this, but I really want to end there. I really wish we had more time for comments, but I think we're at time. So I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Streifer.
Let me just say thank you. This was an amazing discussion. I'm so grateful to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman for leading us in this study and this discussion. I know there are other comments and thoughts and chats. I'm going to invite you all to, if you'd like, to join the Facebook group for Laasok, where we can continue this discussion. I'll send it out in an email afterwards so that you can join us and we can have this conversation. And Rabbi Tuchman, I will send you the chat so that you can read through the comments that people had here.
Yes, please do. And anybody who wants to reach out, there's my website and you can find me there.
So if you give me a minute, everyone, I'll put Rabbi Tuchman's website into the chat. Our next session will be called Mitzvot, V-O-T-E, the Torah of Civic Responsibility, which is on October 28th with Rabbi Dara Lithwick. And again, my deep, deep thanks to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman for this foundational teaching as we begin a year of study about the values around social justice in Judaism and in Jewish texts. Here in the chat, I'm putting a link for Rabbi Tuchman's mailing list, and here is a link for her Patreon, where she puts at least 2 Divrei Torah a month, usually I believe in audio form, so you can learn more with her there. And like I said later, I'd like to invite you all to join us in the Laasok Facebook group so that we can continue this discussion. Thanks again to everyone, and I look forward to seeing you again next month for our next session. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, rabbis.